They left me with nothing, so I took everything legally. They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you how easily it signs away your future on a loan document you never see. I learned this the day my wife and my brother decided I was worth more dead than alive. Their only mistake was forgetting that I was the one who built the house, and I knew where all the legal load-bearing walls were hidden. The afternoon sun cut a dusty gold bar across the worn oak floorboards, landing on the arm of the chair Frank had built the winter his daughter was born. His hand rested there, the skin thin over the knuckles, a slight tremor the only lingering ghost of the illness that had nearly claimed him. For 3 months, the world had been a muffled affair of soft foods, doctor's appointments, and the overly bright, solicitous smiles of his wife, Claire, and his brother, Leo. They treated him like a fragile piece of porcelain, always on the verge of shattering. He had started to believe it himself. The squeak of the mail slot was followed by the familiar soft thud of letters on the welcome mat. A daily ritual. Frank didn't move. Claire would get it when she and Leo returned from their errand, another in a long string of hushed, vague trips they'd been taking together. He closed his eyes, listening to the house breathe around him. He knew its every secret, the groan of the third step on the staircase, the rattle of the window pane in the west-facing guest room when the wind blew just so. He had driven every nail, sanded every surface. This house was not just his home, it was the ledger of his life, written in sawdust and sweat. A sharp rap on the door broke the quiet. Not the mailman's usual knock. Frank rose slowly, his joints protesting, and made his way to the door. Through the beveled glass, he saw the uniformed postal worker holding a clipboard and a stiff, important-looking envelope. "Frank Sterling?" the man asked, his voice businesslike. "That's me. Got a certified letter for you. Need a signature." Frank took the pen and scribbled his name, the familiar motion feeling foreign, his signature weaker than he remembered. He took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. The return address was a law firm had never heard of Blackwood Capital Acquisitions. He was about to set it on the hall table when his eyes caught the addressees, printed in stark black type beneath the firm's logo. To Miss Claire Sterling, Mr. Leo Sterling. Not him. A cold prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. Why would a certified letter for them require his signature? The mailman had already retreated down the path, his truck rumbling to life. Frank stood alone in the entryway, the silence of the house suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a held breath. He turned the envelope over in his hands. It was a simple thing, paper and glue, but it felt dense with consequence. Acting on an instinct he didn't bother to question, he slid his thumb under the flap and tore it open. The document inside was a multi-page loan agreement. The language was dense, a thicket of legal jargon, but certain words leaped out at him, stark and lethal. Principal amount $750,000. Collateral. His eyes scanned down the list, and the air left his lungs in a silent rush. Item A, the property and all structures located at 142 Oak Hollow Lane. His home. Item B, all physical and liquid assets, including equipment, accounts receivable, and goodwill, of the entity known as Sterling Woodcrafts, LLC. His business. His life's work. The company he had inherited from his father and quadrupled in value. He sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The tremor in his hand returned, violent this time, making the papers rattle. A final page contained photocopies of the signatories' driver's licenses and their signatures, bold and clear on the dotted line. Claire Sterling. Leo Sterling. His wife. His brother. The loan had been finalized 6 weeks ago, the day he had been in the ICU, fighting for his life. The world didn't shatter. There was no explosion of rage, no cry of despair. Instead, a terrifying, crystalline clarity settled over him. The solicitous smiles, the whispered phone calls, the endless errands, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed stage play for a dying man. They weren't waiting for him to die. They were simply selling off the parts of his life while he was still breathing, assuming he was too weak, too broken, to ever notice. The frailty he had felt for months evaporated, burned away by the cold fire now hardening in his gut. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the foyer, the hand-carved newel post, the soaring ceiling. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten that a master carpenter knows, better than anyone, the structure of the thing he has built, and exactly where to strike to bring the whole rotten edifice crashing down. The first thing Frank did was fold the loan agreement with painstaking precision, creasing it back into its original lines before sliding it into the envelope. He tucked it inside a thick book on joinery on the living room shelf, a place no one but him would ever look. When he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, he arranged himself back in the armchair, pulling the worn Afghan over his legs and letting his head loll slightly to the side, a perfect portrait of exhaustion. Claire and Leo entered, their voices dropping to stage whispers the moment they saw him. "Oh, the poor dear," Claire murmured, gliding over to place a cool hand on his forehead. He.S. exhausted himself just sitting there. "Did you have a good rest, Frank?" He blinked slowly, feigning a groggy awakening. "Just dozed off," he managed, his voice a gravelly imitation of his recent weakness. "We brought you that chicken soup you like," Leo said, his smile a size too large for his face. He patted Frank's shoulder, a gesture that felt less like brotherly affection and more like a man checking the stability of a structure he planned to demolish. For the next 2 days, Frank became a ghost in his own home, a master of the slow shuffle and the weary sigh. He was an audience to a play written for his benefit. He learned to listen to the house in a new way, not for its familiar creaks, but for the spaces where conversations hid. He'd pause outside the closed study door, pretending to catch his breath, and catch fragments carried on the air. "The power of attorney is ironclad," the lawyer assured me, Leo's voice, low and urgent. "With his medical records, no judge will question it." A moment of silence, then Claire's response, sharper. "We need to finalize the asset transfers. The capital firm is getting impatient. We can't have anything showing up on the quarterly reports before it's all consolidated." Power of attorney. Asset transfers. The words were keys, unlocking the mechanics of their treachery. They weren't just thieves, they were architects, building a legal cage around him while he slept. The betrayal wasn't a crime of passion, it was a business plan. The final piece of the puzzle came not from a whisper, but from the blandly cheerful voice of a stranger. On Wednesday morning, Claire and Leo left for another meeting with their financial advisor. The moment their car was gone, Frank walked to his office, his real office, the one in the house, not the one at the workshop they now controlled. He sat in his leather chair, the seat cold from disuse, and dialed the direct business line for his bank. A young woman answered, her voice crisp and professional. "Midland Commerce Bank, this is Maria. How can I help you?" Frank cleared his throat, summoning the authority that had been his for 30 years. "Frank Sterling, Sterling Woodcrafts. I need to authorize a wire transfer to our lumber supplier, Northwood Timber. Standard amount." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Let me just pull up your account." There was a soft clicking of a keyboard. Frank stared at a photograph on his desk, a younger him, Claire, and Leo, all laughing on a boat, the sun in their eyes. A lifetime ago. Maria's voice returned, a note of polite confusion in it. "I'm sorry, sir, I seem to have a flag here on my end. Can you hold one moment?" "Fine," Frank said, his knuckles white on the receiver. The wait stretched for an eternity. He could hear faint hold music, a tinny, soulless tune that felt like a mockery. Finally, Maria came back on the line, her professional kindness unwavering. "Thank you for holding, Mr. Sterling. I've clarified the account status. I am unable to process that request for you, as the authorization protocols were recently updated." "Updated?" "I didn't authorize any update," Frank said, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, sir," she said, her tone a placid recitation of facts. according to our records, you are no longer the primary signatory on the account. All financial authorizations for Sterling Woodcrafts must now be approved by the designated power of attorney, a Ms. Claire Sterling. There it was. Not an accusation, not a dramatic revelation. Just a simple, procedural fact delivered by a stranger doing her job. The kindness in her voice, the utter lack of malice, made the truth land with the cold, dense weight of a granite block. He had been surgically excised from his own life. I see, Frank said, the words feeling like dust in his mouth. Thank you for your time, Maria. He hung up the phone and sat perfectly still in the silent office. He was not a man anymore. He was a line item, a legal fiction, a ghost haunting a balance sheet. And in that moment, the carpenter who had spent his life building things knew, with absolute certainty, that he would now have to learn how to take something apart. Frank's first act of rebellion was small and anonymous. He paid cash for a burner phone at a strip mall electronics store, the air thick with the smell of ozone and plastic. The transaction was devoid of personality, a stark contrast to the cloying, intimate charade he now endured at home. Back in his truck, he unwrapped the cheap device, its plastic shell feeling flimsy and dishonest in his calloused hands. It was the perfect tool for the job ahead. He drove to a public park and sat on a bench overlooking a duck pond, the phone feeling alien in his palm. He dialed a number he knew by heart. 2 rings, and a familiar voice answered, warm and precise. Samir. Samir, it's Frank Sterling. There was a pause. Frank. My God, I heard you were. Are you all right? You sound different. I'm fine, Frank said, the lie tasting like ash. Listen, I need your help. Something you're good at. But not over these phones. Not at my house. Another pause, this one charged with understanding. Samir Joshi had been his friend for 20 years, the man who had helped him incorporate Sterling Woodcrafts and navigated him through every tax season since. He was a creature of logic and ledgers, a man who believed numbers never lied. My garden, Samir said finally. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Come through the side gate. The next morning, Frank found Samir on his knees, tending to a row of immaculate rose bushes, his hands protected by thick leather gloves. The garden was a masterpiece of order, a sharp rebuke to the quiet chaos consuming Frank's own life. Samir stood, dusting the dirt from his trousers. He didn't tee off or platitudes or ask about Frank's health. He simply looked at him, his dark eyes sharp with inquiry. Show me, he said. Frank didn't speak. He handed Samir the copy of the loan agreement he'd made at the library. Samir read it, his expression hardening from concern to a cold, professional focus. He walked to a stone bench, sat, and read it again, his finger tracing the lines of legalese. 750,000, Samir murmured, more to himself than to Frank. Collateralized against everything. They left you nothing. He looked up. Frank, this is surgical. They think I'm dying, Frank stated, the words flat and hard. They think I'm too sick to notice. He then explained the power of attorney, the locked accounts, the hushed conversations. Samir nodded slowly, the gears of his mind already turning. They're building a narrative. The ailing patriarch, mentally unfit. It gives them cover for everything. To fight this, we need a counter-narrative. We need the truth, written in their own numbers. I need access to the books, Frank. Every transaction for the last 6 months. They've locked me out of the office servers, Frank said. Physically and digitally. A faint, predatory smile touched Samir's lips. But did they know about your private cloud backup? The one I insisted you set up 5 years ago after that ransomware scare. A flicker of life returned to Frank's eyes. I still have the credentials. Good, Samir said, standing up and stripping off his gloves. Send them to me from your new, untraceable phone. And Frank? Go home. Be frail. Be forgetful. Be the man they expect you to be. I'll descend into the digital mine and see what monsters I can find. For 4 days, Frank played his part with agonizing dedication, each meal with Claire and Leo a masterclass in deception. The waiting was a form of torture, a slow burn of anxiety. Finally, a text came to the burner phone library. Study room 4. Now. Samir was waiting, the small table covered in printouts. He had not found a smoking gun, he had found an entire armory. In the center of the table was a flowchart he had drawn. A box labeled Sterling Woodcrafts, LLC had a thick red arrow pointing to a new box. Oak Hollow Holdings Incorporated. A shell corporation, Samir explained, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Registered 6 months ago. The directors? Claire and Leo. Over the past 3 months, they've been systematically siphoning your assets. Inflated invoices to non-existent vendors, management fees, equipment sales. The money flows from your company into theirs, clean as a whistle. This loan, he tapped the original document, was to give them the final lump of operating capital they needed to go independent after they completed the transition. Frank stared at the diagram. It was the blueprint of his own destruction. That's not the worst of it, Samir continued, sliding another document across the table. It was a draft of a legal petition, prepared by their lawyers but not yet filed. Petition for conservatorship. It was filled with medical terminology cherry-picked from his hospital stay, painting a picture of a man whose mind was failing, a man who was a danger to himself and his own financial interests. They're not just stealing your company, Samir said softly. They're planning to steal your name, your mind, your legal right to exist. They are preparing to have you declared medically incompetent. Frank didn't look up from the petition. He read the clinical, cruel words that sought to erase him. The rage he expected to feel was absent, replaced by something colder and heavier. It was the feeling of a foundation settling, of finding solid bedrock beneath the mud. He folded the petition carefully, as if it were a fragile historical document. He finally met his friend's gaze, his eyes clear and hard as winter ice. They built a cage, Frank said. Now, you and I are going to get the blueprints and take it apart, piece by piece. Samir's voice over the burner phone was a calm island in Frank's turbulent world. They're building their case on your present medical condition, Frank. We need to build ours on history. The whole history. I need the original incorporation documents for Sterling Woodcrafts, the initial property filings, tax records from as far back as you can find. We need to establish an unbroken chain of ownership that predates their entire scheme. The request sent Frank on a journey into his own past. The attic. He waited until Claire and Leo were gone for the afternoon, their departure announced with a cloying reminder for him to take it easy and not overdo it. The moment their car disappeared down the lane, he pulled down the folding attic stairs, the mechanism groaning in the silence. Climbing the steps was a slow, deliberate act. Each tread seemed to mark a year of his life, and as his head emerged into the upper dimness, he was met with the familiar, sacred scent of old wood, dried paper, and time itself. A single dormer window cast a pale, dusty light across a landscape of forgotten thin stacks of furniture shrouded in white sheets like slumbering ghosts, boxes of his daughter's school projects, his father's old fishing gear. It was the family's archival memory, and he was now a trespasser in it. He located the filing cabinets where decades of tax returns were stored. He worked methodically, his carpenter's mind sorting through the ordered chaos. Box after box of receipts, PL statements, and tax forms passed through his hands, a dry and brittle history of his life's work. He found the incorporation papers from 1985, a proud document signed in his father's bold hand. He found the property tax records from the year he built the house. But the original filings Samir wanted, the very first ones, were missing. Frustration began to prickle at him. He scanned the crowded space, his eyes adjusting to the low light. And then he saw it, tucked away under the eaves, almost completely obscured by a stack of old storm windows. It was his great-grandfather's chest. He hadn't thought about it in years. It was made of dark, heavy cedar, banded with hand-forged iron straps, a testament to a time when things were built to outlast men. His great-grandfather, the first sterling to work wood on this land, had built it to carry his tools from the old country. Frank ran his hand over the rough sawn lid, the grain of the wood a familiar language beneath his fingertips. It was locked with a heavy, ornate iron lock, green with age. He didn't need to search for the key. He knew exactly where it was. A memory, crisp and clear, surfaced from his childhood, his father holding the heavy key, telling him a man's most important tools should always be close at hand. He descended the attic stairs and walked to his personal workshop, the one attached to the house. He ignored the professional-grade machinery, the tools of his trade. He went to the old wooden workbench his grandfather had used, its surface scarred with the ghosts of 1,000 projects. In a small, hidden drawer built into the leg of the bench, a secret known only to him and his father before him, his fingers closed around the cold, heavy iron of the key. Back in the attic, the key turned in the lock with a reluctant, grinding groan, the sound of years of disuse. He lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped was thick with the scent of cedar and mothballs. The top layer was a jumble of family history, sepia-toned photographs of stern-faced ancestors, a yellowed christening gown, a child's leather-bound diary. He gently lifted the tray holding these fragile relics. Beneath it, lying flat on the cedar floor of the chest, was a single, large document. It was not paper, but vellum, thick and creamy with age. It was folded and tied with a faded red ribbon, the knot sealed with a blob of dark red wax, still intact, bearing the faint impression of a signet ring. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from a sense of profound gravity. He carefully untied the ribbon, the brittle wax cracking slightly under the pressure. He unfolded the vellum. The script was a beautiful, flowing cursive, written in ink that had faded from black to a soft brown. It was the original deed for the 100 acres of land he stood upon, dated 1888. It detailed the purchase by his great-grandfather, Alastair Sterling, from the township. It was a founding document, the bedrock upon which everything, the house, the business, his family, his entire life, had been built. It was a tangible piece of the soul of his legacy, preserved in a chest by the man who had started it all. He held not just a legal document, but a will, a promise passed down through time. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this dusty piece of history was the key to his future. Samir recommended Eleanor Vance. He didn't say she was the best, he said she was a shark who happened to practice property law. Her office was in a sleek downtown tower, a world of glass and steel that felt a universe away from Frank's sawdust-strewn workshop. The firm's name was etched on a glass door, Vance Associates. Frank, dressed in the best suit he owned, felt like a man visiting a foreign country without knowing the language. Eleanor Vance was a study in controlled energy. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing and hair pulled back so tightly it looked severe. She didn't offer coffee or pleasantries. She gestured for Frank to sit, her hands folded on a vast, empty mahogany desk. Mr. Joshi spoke highly of your predicament, she began, her voice as crisp as a new banknote. He also said you found something historical. Frank didn't speak. He opened his briefcase and carefully laid the vellum deed on her desk. The ancient document looked profoundly out of place in a sterile, modern office. Eleanor leaned forward, a flicker of genuine curiosity in her eyes. She donned a pair of reading glasses and handled the deed with the delicate reverence of a museum curator. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint rustle of the vellum as she read, her finger tracing the elegant, archaic script. Frank sat perfectly still, feeling like a supplicant before a high priestess. She read it through once, then a second time, more slowly. She paused, her gaze fixed on a dense paragraph near the end of the document. She took off her glasses and looked at Frank, a strange, calculating expression on her face. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone shifting from academic interest to professional intensity, "where has this been?" "In a chest." "In my attic," Frank replied. "Has it ever been filed with the county registrar? Re-recorded or updated in any way since its original execution in 1888? "Not that I know of. I believe it's been in that chest for over a century." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was not a warm smile, it was the satisfied look of a predator that has just spotted a fatal weakness in its prey. "Mr. Sterling, your wife and brother have committed a rather monumental blunder. They built their entire house of cards on a foundation of sand." She turned the document so Frank could see it. She pointed to the paragraph she had been studying. "This is a pre-standardization deed. The language is antiquated. Look here." Her manicured finger rested on a line of text. "The aforesaid parcel of land, and all improvements, structures, and enterprises thereupon, shall be held in trust and passed in perpetuity through the direct male bloodline of the grantee, Alastair Sterling, and shall not be pledged, sold, or otherwise encumbered by any other party, matrimonial or fraternal." Frank read the words, but the meaning didn't immediately register. Eleanor clarified, her voice sharp with the thrill of the chase. "It's an ironclad succession clause. A legal relic. It's a form of entailment, designed to keep land in a family's name forever. By the standards of 1888, it was airtight. And because it was never updated, never superseded by a modern deed, it remains the primary, governing document for this land." "What does that mean?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse. "It means," Eleanor said, a dangerous glint in her eye, "that your wife never had any legal claim to the property through marital assets. It means your brother had no standing whatsoever. It means that according to the founding document, the only person on this earth with the legal authority to use this land or the business built on it as collateral is you. They took out a $750,000 loan against an asset they had no legal right to touch." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Their loan agreement is, legally speaking, a work of fiction." The cold knot of dread that had been sitting in Frank's stomach for weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't, he hoped, not yet. It was something harder, stronger. It was the feeling of solid ground. "They've built a cage," Frank said, echoing the words he'd spoken to Samir. "Indeed," Eleanor replied, her smile widening. "And your great-grandfather, 130 years ago, handed you the key." Eleanor Vance's final instruction was the hardest to follow. "The efficacy of this deed," she had explained, her voice devoid of any warmth, "depends on the element of surprise. They are operating under a specific set of assumptions about property law and, more importantly, about you. We will dismantle those assumptions all at once. Until then, Mr. Sterling, you are to go home and be precisely the man they believe you to be: frail, oblivious, and fading." So Frank went home and became an actor. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing performance. He lived inside a lie, moving through the rooms of his own house like a ghost, his true thoughts and intentions locked away behind a carefully constructed mask of weary confusion. He shuffled when he walked. He let his hand tremble when he reached for a glass of water. He would stare out the window for long stretches, feigning a vacant detachment, while his mind raced, replaying every detail of Eleanor's strategy. The charade was most painful during meals. He sat at the head of the dining table he had built with his own hands, a Kenyan exile in his own court. Claire would cut his food for him, a gesture of solicitous care that now felt like a violation. Leo would recount sanitized, cheerful news from the workshop, stories of new contracts and happy clients, a fiction designed to soothe the man they were actively robbing. "The new cabinetry line is a huge hit, Frank," Leo said one evening, his voice booming with false heartiness. "You'd be proud." Frank only nodded slowly, pushing a piece of chicken around his plate. That's good, Leo," he mumbled, letting his eyes lose focus. He could feel their shared glance across the table, a silent communication of pity and relief. He doesn't key suspect a thing. Each of these moments was a small, sharp cut. He was mourning a life that was not yet officially over, saying a long, silent goodbye to the wife and brother he thought he knew. Meanwhile, a silent war was being waged from Eleanor Vance's sterile, glass-walled office. Frank received encrypted updates from her via a secure messaging app on his burner phone, reading them late at night in the pale glow of the screen, the only light in his darkened bedroom. The first message was a scan of a validated historical document from the county archives. Eleanor had authenticated the 1888 deed, confirming its primacy. The next was a court filing a request for an immediate, ex parte injunction, to be served without prior notice, to freeze all assets of Sterling Woodcrafts and Oak Hollow Holdings. Then came the ownership reclamation petitions, meticulously drafted documents that cited the ironclad succession clause as irrefutable proof of his sole claim. Samir worked in parallel, a financial ghost tracing the flow of stolen money. He produced a comprehensive report, a ledger of betrayal, detailing every fraudulent invoice and every diverted dollar. It was a cold, numerical account of Claire and Leo's greed, and it formed the spine of the financial clawback motions Eleanor was preparing. Frank watched the legal trap being built, piece by meticulous piece. It was like watching one of his own complex woodworking projects come together. Every joint had to be perfect, every measurement exact. There was no room for error. Eleanor was the master carpenter now, and she was building a cage of law and precedent, a structure from which there would be no escape. One afternoon, Claire found him sitting in his armchair, staring at a framed photograph of their wedding day. She knelt beside him, her expression a perfect mask of gentle concern. "What are you thinking about, honey?" she asked softly. He looked from the smiling face of the young woman in the photograph to the calculating stranger beside him. For a moment, the facade almost cracked. The urge to confront her, to scream the ugly truth into her face, was a physical force inside him. But he saw Eleanor's cold, steady gaze in his mind's eye. The element of surprise. He took a slow, deliberate breath. "Just remembering," he said, his voice thick with a weariness that was only partly feigned. "It all feels like a long time ago." She patted his hand. "Just rest, Frank. Leo and I are taking care of everything." He simply nodded and closed his eyes. The storm was coming. All he had to do was wait for the wind to change. The message arrived on the burner phone at 6:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was a single word from Eleanor today. Frank read it, and a strange calm settled over him. The waiting was over. He got out of bed, moving with a purpose he hadn't allowed himself in weeks. When he went downstairs, Claire and Leo were already dressed in their business attire, looking sharp and confident. "Big meeting with the Blackwood Capital people this morning," Leo announced, pouring coffee. "Just finalizing the next phase of our expansion. Wish us luck." "Good luck," Frank said, his voice even. He met Claire's eyes over the rim of his mug. She gave him a small, patronizing smile. "We'll be back around lunchtime," she said. "Don't tire yourself out." Frank watched from the living room window as their silver sedan pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. The moment it was gone, he walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool morning air. A plain white van was parked across the street. A man in a simple blue work shirt got out and gave Frank a slight nod. The operation had begun. The locksmith was a quiet professional who worked with swift, efficient movements. He started on the front door, his tools making small, precise clicks and whirs. Frank stood in the foyer, the sound echoing in the silent house. It was a strangely intimate act, like watching a surgeon at work. Each deadbolt, each lock set, was a part of the house's anatomy he had installed himself. Now, they were being removed, replaced, rekeyed against the very people who had slept there the night before. While the locksmith worked on the house, a second van, this one bearing the logo of a private security firm, pulled up to the main gate of Sterling Woodcrafts a mile down the road. Acting on Eleanor's authority, they informed the skeleton crew that the business was closed for the day for a systems-wide security audit and sent them home. Then their locksmith got to work, changing the locks on every gate, every office door, every workshop entrance. Frank went to his study and logged into his computer. At precisely 9:45 a.m., following Eleanor's timeline, he sent a pre-drafted email to the bank manager at Midland Commerce. It contained a scanned copy of the injunction, the validated 1888 deed, and a formal letter from Vance Associates. The email invoked his primary ownership and instructed the bank to immediately freeze all personal and corporate accounts associated with Claire Sterling, Leo Sterling, and Oak Hollow Holdings Incorporated. The final piece of the plan was the most direct. At 10:00 a.m., just as Claire and Leo were likely settling in for their meeting, 2 bicycle couriers were dispatched by Eleanor's office. One went to the downtown high-rise housing Blackwood Capital. The other went to the firm representing Claire and Leo. They carried identical, thick envelopes. Inside the meeting room, Claire and Leo were projecting confidence, outlining a bold future for their new enterprise. The lenders were nodding, impressed. A polite knock at the conference room door interrupted them. A junior associate entered and handed a large manila envelope to Leo. "A courier just delivered this for you, sir." Marked urgent. Leo took it, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the interruption. He tore it open. Claire watched, a questioning look on her face. As Leo's eyes scanned the first page, the bold, stark heading of a court-issued injunction, the blood drained from his face. His confident posture collapsed. He shoved the papers across the table to Claire, his hands shaking. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to pure, uncomprehending rage. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a fraud alert from her bank. Her credit card had just been declined while trying to pay for the coffee service for the meeting. At the same moment, Leo's phone rang. It was the foreman from the workshop. "Leo. What the hell is going on? There's a security team here and they've locked us out. They said you don't have the authority to be here." The lenders watched, their polite smiles freezing and then evaporating, replaced by looks of cold, dawning suspicion. The carefully constructed world of Claire and Leo Sterling was not just cracking, it was being vaporized in real time. Back at the house, Frank stood as the locksmith finished the last door. He was handed a single, new key. It felt heavy in his palm, heavier than any key he had ever held. It was the key to his house, his business, his life. The house was silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of control. The call from their lawyer had been frantic, a chaotic mess of legal threats and sputtering indignation that Eleanor Vance had absorbed with the placid calm of a stone wall in a hurricane. She had offered them one thing: a meeting. That afternoon. In her office. She called it a clarification session. They, clinging to the hope of a negotiation or a procedural error they could exploit, had agreed. Frank was not there. At Eleanor's insistence, he remained at home, a general watching the final battle from a remote command center. He sat in his study, the new key to his house on the desk beside him, a silent testament to the changed reality. Claire and Leo arrived at Eleanor's office looking ravaged. Their tailored business clothes, so full of authority that morning, now seemed like ill-fitting costumes. Leo's face was pale and slick with sweat. Claire's was a tight mask of controlled fury, her eyes burning with a desperate, cornered animal energy. They stormed into the conference room, their lawyer trailing nervously behind them. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Vance?" Claire began, her voice shaking with rage. "These strong-arm tactics are illegal. Frank is not well. You are taking advantage of a sick man. We will have these injunctions thrown out by morning." Eleanor Vance did not rise. She gestured to the chairs opposite her at the vast, polished table. "Please, sit." Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which seemed to infuriate them even more. "We are not sitting," Leo snarled. "We are here to discuss the terms of your client's surrender. This is a frivolous, malicious action, and we will countersue for damages." "You will not be doing any such thing," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through his tirade with the clean, sharp edge of a scalpel. She slid a single, plastic-sleeved document across the table. It stuck directly in front of them. It was the vellum deed. Their lawyer, a man named Peterson, picked it up, his professional curiosity overriding his bluster. Claire and Leo stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "What is this?" Claire demanded. "Some forged piece of..." "That," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on them, "is the original, notarized, and county-validated deed of grant for the 100 acres of land known as 142 Oak Hollow Lane, dated October 12, 1888. It is the founding document of the Sterling estate. And I suggest you read paragraph 7. Peterson's eyes scanned the document, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He read the ironclad succession clause, then read it again, his mouth falling slightly open. This can't be right," he stammered, looking up at Eleanor. "This is an entailed deed. They haven't been legally valid for." "It is not about current validity," Eleanor countered smoothly. "It is about historical primacy. This document was never superseded. No subsequent deed was ever filed to dissolve this clause. Therefore, it remains the legally governing instrument for the ownership of that land and, as it explicitly states, all improvements, structures, and enterprises thereupon." She let the silence hang in the room for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blows. "My client, Mr. Frank Sterling, as the direct male descendant of Alastair Sterling, is the sole legal title holder. As such, Miss Sterling, your claim to the property as a marital asset is void. And Mr. Sterling," she said, turning her gaze to Leo, "you have never, at any point, possessed any legal interest in the property whatsoever." The color drained completely from Leo's face. Claire stared, speechless, her rage collapsing into visible, crumbling disbelief. "The loan you secured from Blackwood Capital," Eleanor continued, her tone now as cold and hard as the glass tower around them, "was fraudulent. You misrepresented your authority to pledge those assets. The injunctions are therefore not frivolous, they are a necessary corrective action. Sterling Woodcrafts and all its holdings revert to their rightful owner, effective immediately." "The loan," Claire whispered, the word catching in her throat. "The debt." "Ah, the debt," Eleanor said, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "That is the one part of this transaction that is entirely your own. You signed the agreement. You took the money. The fact that your collateral was illusory is a matter for you and your creditors to discuss. My client's assets, however, are now shielded from that liability. Permanently." She stood up, the meeting clearly over. "You have built a very expensive, very precarious structure on land you did not own. And the ground has just given way. I suggest you consult with Mr. Peterson about the finer points of bankruptcy law." They just sat there, two ghosts at a board meeting, staring at a piece of paper that had, in the space of 5 minutes, unwritten their entire future. The collapse was not a slow crumble, it was an implosion. Justice, in this case, was not a blind goddess with a set of scales, but a team of corporate lawyers with calculators. Blackwood Capital, realizing they were holding a $750,000 unsecured loan based on fraudulent collateral, moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a shark sensing blood. They didn't sue Oak Hollow Holdings, the shell corporation. As Samir had predicted, the entity was nothing more than a legal fiction with no real assets of its own. Instead, they invoked the personal guarantee clauses Claire and Leo had eagerly signed, clauses that made them individually and jointly liable for the full amount of the debt. The legal filings were a matter of public record, and Frank watched from a distance as the consequences cascaded. The first casualty was the silver sedan. It was a leased vehicle, a symbol of their anticipated wealth, and it was repossessed from the curb outside Leo's rented townhouse within a week. Next came the letters, then the summonses. Their personal bank accounts, already frozen by Frank's injunction, were now targeted by liens from Blackwood's attorneys. The life they had been building on the foundation of Frank's legacy was being unbuilt, piece by methodical piece. Claire arrived at the house 2 days after the meeting with Eleanor. Frank saw her coming up the walk, but he didn't open the door. She tried her key, a useless piece of metal now, and when it failed to turn, she began to pound on the solid oak door. Her cries were muffled, indistinct pleas and accusations that he listened to without emotion. He simply stood in a silent foyer until she gave up and slumped away, a stranger at the gates of a life that was no longer hers. Leo tried a different approach. He called Frank's personal cell phone, a number he hadn't used in months. Frank answered, curious to hear what the man would say. There was no apology, no remorse. Only a desperate, wheedling rage. "You've ruined us, Frank." Leo's voice was ragged. "For what?" cried. "You couldn't just let us take care of things. We would have looked after you. You were selling the floorboards out from under my bed while you told me to get some rest, Leo," Frank replied, his voice calm and even. "That isn't taking care of someone. That's burying them." He hung up before Leo could respond and blocked the number. The final act of their downfall was quiet and bureaucratic. Faced with overwhelming personal debt and no assets, they filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Frank read the legal notice online, a dry, public declaration of their financial ruin. Every asset they had was listed for liquidation: Leo's collection of expensive watches, Claire's jewelry, the furniture in their homes. It was all to be sold to pay a fraction of the debt they had incurred in their attempt to steal a fortune. They were left with nothing. Not just financially, but completely. They had leveraged their family, their relationships, and their entire history on a single, greedy bet, and they had lost everything. They were legally severed from the house, the business, and the man they had betrayed. They became ghosts in his life, spectral figures defined only by their absence and the wreckage they had left behind. Frank didn't feel triumph. Watching their lives disintegrate wasn't a victory, it was a grim confirmation. He had not acted out of a desire for revenge, but out of the simple, animal instinct of survival. He had been a man in a burning house, and he had done what was necessary to put out the fire. The fact that the arsonists were his own family did not change the nature of the threat, but it left behind the bitter, inescapable smell of smoke. A week after the bankruptcy notice appeared, Frank walked through the gates of Sterling Woodcrafts for the first time in months. The security guard hired by Eleanor nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement of the new regime. Frank slid open the heavy door to the main workshop, and the familiar, almost sacred scent of cedar and machine oil washed over him. It was the smell of his entire adult life. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. The massive table saw stood silent in the center of the room, a fine layer of dust coating its iron surface. He ran his hand along it, his fingers tracing the grooves worn by decades of use. His tools hung in their proper places on the pegboard wall, a collection of steel and wood that felt like extensions of his own hands. He picked up a hand plane, its wooden body smooth and warm from 1,000 hours of his grip. The heft of it was familiar, reassuring. But the purpose felt distant. He walked through the silent shop, past half-finished projects and stacks of raw lumber. He saw the new cabinetry line Leo had boasted about, sleek and modern and soulless. It was competent work, but it lacked the small, indefinable details, the touch of a true craftsman, that had been his father's hallmark, and his own. It was a product, not a creation. He felt no pride in it, only a hollow sense of alienation. This was his kingdom, reclaimed, but the joy of his rule was gone. The feeling deepened when he returned to the house. The locksmith had done his job well. The structure was secure. But inside, it was no longer a home. It was just a house, a collection of rooms filled with memories that were now tainted. He stood in the dining room, looking at the long oak table. He could almost see them there, Claire at the far end, Leo to his right, all of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke. The image was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there, and which he now understood had perhaps never truly been there at all. He had thought he was building a life for his family, but he had only been building a stage for their avarice. He wandered into the living room and his eyes fell on the armchair, the one where he had sat playing the invalid. He had won the war from that chair, but it offered no comfort now. It was just a piece of furniture. The Afghan his wife had once draped over him lay folded on the seat, and he picked it up, the yarn rough against his skin. It was just an object, stripped of the meaning he had once given it. The silence was the most profound change. For years, the house had been filled with the sounds of a life being lived conversation, the clatter of pans from the kitchen, the low murmur of the television. Now, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a relentless, mechanical marking of empty time. Each tick was an echo in a vast, lonely space. He had fought to save his legacy, and he had won. The house stood. The business was his. The name Sterling was secure. But the victory felt like a Pyrrhic one. He was the king of a castle, but the castle was empty. The family he had built it all for had revealed themselves to be the invaders, and in repelling them, he had been left to rule over the silent, lonely ramparts. He stood by the window, looking out at the land his great-grandfather had bought, a solitary figure and a monument to a life that had been saved, but also irrevocably broken. The first frost of autumn had silvered the wide planks of the porch. Frank sat in a simple rocking chair he'd built years ago, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. 6 months had passed. The sun crested the distant ridge of pines, spilling liquid gold across the land, the same way it had for 100 years before he was born, and the way it would for 100 years after he was gone. The view was unchanged, a constant in a life that had been fractured and reset. He had reopened the workshop. At first, the silence had been a crushing weight, the absence of Leo's boisterous talk and the phantom presence of Claire bringing him lunch a constant, dull ache. For a month, he did nothing but maintenance, sharpening blades, oiling machinery, organizing lumber, the quiet, meditative tasks of a man putting his house in order. He had no interest in chasing the large contracts, the commercial jobs that had been the focus of their expansion. Then, one day, he had called the local trade school and asked if they had any promising students who needed an apprenticeship. A week later, a quiet, serious young man named Daniel showed up, his eyes wide with a reverence for the old tools and machinery. Frank found a new, unexpected rhythm in teaching. He found himself explaining not just the how, but the why. He spoke of the grain of the wood as if it were a language, of the proper heft of a chisel as a matter of feel and instinct. He was not just passing on a trade, he was transmitting a legacy, piece by piece, to a new generation. He thought of the word people might use for what he had done: revenge. It felt foreign, ill-fitting, like a cheap suit. His actions hadn't been born of heat and rage. He recalled the cold, clear-headed precision of it all: the burner phone, Samir's spreadsheets, Eleanor's merciless legal prose. It had not been an act of passion. It had been a careful, structural repair. He had discovered a rot in the very foundation of his life and had been forced to tear out the compromised beams to save the entire house. The work had been grim and methodical, not gleeful. There was no satisfaction in demolition, only necessity. Justice, too, was a complicated thing. There had been no single moment of triumph, no courtroom scene where the gavel fell in his favor. Victory had arrived in sterile manila envelopes and through encrypted emails. It was the quiet confirmation of an account balance restored, a title cleared, a lien removed. It was the absence of a threat, not the presence of a prize. He had seen the public notice of Claire and Leo's bankruptcy auction. Their lives, sold off in numbered lots to strangers. He had felt no joy, only a profound and weary sadness for the people they could have been, for the family he once believed he had. He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked out at the land, the fields, and the workshop and the house, all of it bathed in the clean light of a new day. He finally understood that his fight hadn't been for ownership in the modern sense, a name on a piece of paper, a number in a bank account. He had been fighting for stewardship. His great-grandfather hadn't just bought a plot of land, he had made a promise through time, written in archaic ink on vellum, that this place, and the work done on it, would endure. That ironclad clause had not been a tool of control, but a declaration of permanence. Frank's battle was an echo of that declaration. He hadn't been acting for himself alone, but as the current guardian of that century-old trust. The cost of that guardianship had been devastating. It had cost him his marriage, his brother, the entire narrative of his past. It required him to excise a part of his own life, a painful but necessary amputation to stop the spread of a poison. True justice, he now realized, was not about balancing the scales to achieve satisfaction. It was about preserving what is right, what is true, what is meant to last, and accepting the scars that come with that preservation. The screen door creaked open and shut behind him. It was Daniel, arriving early as always, a canvas bag of tools slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Mr. Sterling," the young man said, his voice full of a quiet respect that Frank was slowly learning to accept. "Morning, Daniel," Frank replied, taking a final sip of his coffee. He rose from the rocking chair, his joints protesting less than they used to. The sun was fully up now, and the workshop was waiting. Let us get to work. And so, Frank's story comes to a close. In the end, we learn that blood may not be thicker than water, but a legacy, etched into an ancient deed, can be stronger than both. His victory wasn't loud or triumphant, it was the quiet, solid work of a man reinforcing the load-bearing walls of his life. It reminds us that sometimes, the hardest thing to build is a future from the wreckage of the past. That was a powerful journey, and we're so glad you joined us for it here on Content Channel. It makes you think about the lines we draw and the prices we pay for justice. What do you think was the most difficult moment for Frank, intercepting that first letter, or sitting silently at the dinner table while maintaining his facade of weakness? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Join us next time, where a young apprentice discovers that the most valuable lesson his mentor left him wasn't in a will, but hidden in the grain of an unfinished project.